Yeah, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Sian Pooley. Sian is a tutorial fellow in modern British history at Magdalen College in Oxford. She's written widely about childhood, especially parenting and child care. But her paper today is on a different topic. Is about children's writing and subjectivity in late 19th and early 20th century England.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here and a great privilege to have the chance to be part of a day which I think promises to be a really fascinating collection of papers, so thank you. So I'm going to begin with 3 preliminary points that hopefully make sense of what's to come. I want to start by doing some work with the title of today's conference, Challenges in the History of Childhood. Can I have my PowerPoint up? And, it's an apt title, placing a spotlight on the conceptual, methodological and historiographical puzzles with which we all grapple in seeking to understand children's lives in the past. Yet, what I'd like to do today, in the next 40 minutes, is to suggest that it's also useful to turn the title round. I'm going to suggest that we shouldn't just think of challenges as a tactful synonym for problems, as businesses and indeed universities are wont to do. What I believe it's also crucial to think about is challenges from the history of childhood. Here, challenges comes to mean something disruptive, unsettling, and importantly of fundamental significance to how we think about much broader questions relating to the past and how we write history. So we can challenge from our work in the history of childhood, making it imperative that we speak not just to others as we do today, but out to wider historiographical and historical contexts to show how the lives of children matter to these broader narratives as well. So why do I find it more useful to frame my work as studying challenges from rather than in the history of childhood? To illustrate this, it's perhaps useful to think a little biographically with an anecdote, which I promised myself I would find a way to use as a way of taking something positive out of a tiresome evening. I was recently talking with another academic. I answered the perennial question of what my research was about, explaining something along the lines that my doctoral research had explored how adult men and women living in 19th century and early 20th century Britain were altered by the experience of becoming parents, or my current research examines how children understood their childhoods in the same time period. He then learnt from another academic that I'd just been appointed to a lectureship, at which point he looked aghast, turned to the man on his other side and said, "Is that what they appoint to history lectureships these days?" Thankfully, this was an extreme reaction, but hopefully it also makes the point that for me the fundamental challenge, in the problem sense of historians of childhood, is to show how and how far, by thinking through the acts, impacts and articulations of children, we can challenge what we thought we knew about the past and how we write it. So these are outward rather than inward-looking challenges. With this in mind, the paper is going to be structured around 3 of these broad challenges that grow out of my own research, but I'd like to suggest might disrupt some of our historical and historiographical assumptions. I'll consider in turn themes around agency, around causation, and around subjectivity. The second brief point I want to make is I'm aware that many of the delights of a conference like this are that we all have interests in very diverse times, places, and approaches. So this means that I know that there are claims about childhood in modern Britain that I'll be making now, but your expertise in other times and places will challenge and refine. So it will be wonderful to keep on thinking thematically about these comparisons and connections as we work through today. We can then begin to establish what was truly novel, for instance about childhood in modern Britain compared to that in modern France, or that in the 17th or 18th century, and what was not. As a final introductory point, I decided that the clearest way to explain the methodology behind my research was to work through an example from a single source. It's important to underline that I'm not going to centre this paper on exploring methodological or practical issues that arise from these sources, but I'm of course very happy to talk about this later. So, on Monday the 3rd of February 1890, an 8-year-old boy, Roscoe Taylor, sat down at his home here on the moors above Chorley in Lancashire to write a letter. He sent his 250 words to a newspaper published 20 miles away in Manchester. 5 days later, his parents, as usual, bought the Saturday edition of the penny newspaper, the Manchester Times. There, Roscoe's words were published in a column entitled The Children's Hour, which the newspaper's editor had included weekly for the previous 4 years. This slide shows an extract from the column in which the letter was published, where it was surrounded by other letters, puzzles, poems, and competition entries sent in by children. In the columns to the right were published all the names of those children who wanted to become members of a column society, which by this point numbered more than 65,000 children, the vast majority of whom were working class and living in South Lancashire. So these letters to children's columns are the sources from which my research begins. By studying the development of these columns each week over their whole lifespan, it's possible to link together the different compositions of each young writer and their siblings. So, for instance, we know that Roscoe had been listed as the author of published letters for the column 3 times in 1889 to 90, and his older siblings also participated in the column. From this, therefore, it's then possible to identify Roscoe's family and his siblings in the census enumerators books, which offer snapshots of the residents of every household in Britain every 10 years between 1841 and 1911. So we know that Roscoe was the son of a farm labourer, and by 1891, as we can see from his family's entry in the census, shown on this slide, his father described himself as a farmer, while his 15-year-old sister was employed as a cotton factory worker. We know from this context that these children who wrote really lived, and they were growing up in the context about which they were writing. So we can read Roscoe's letter on this slide. Its content, tone, and his social background are fairly typical of the letters that were sent in by young writers. The third stage of my research is to trace out intertextually from what the children wrote, the experiences, ideas, source information, characters, and writing styles on which they drew. So here Roscoe, we can see, refers to his reading of a previous week's letters and stories, published in the children's column of the Manchester Times, and on family news gained from his letters from his sister in Florida and his aunt in Canada, seemingly passed around and debated at home about his cousins and and other family members. Interestingly, although Roscoe noted that he'd been given a copy of a boy's own paper, one of the most famous journals for children at the time, there's no evidence from his letters that he engaged with its content, tone, or very distinctive writing style, in a way that he did with his weekly reading of the local newspaper. So children's compositions routinely display this hybridity as texts, in pasting together ideas from diverse sources and making others' writing into their own. This makes them ideal windows to think about the dissemination, reception, and interpretation of both children's books and of cultures of writing, of speaking, and of engagement that went far beyond children's cultures. So Roscoe's was just one of hundreds of thousands of letters sent by children to be published in this sort of participatory children's column in a provincial weekly press. This culture of juvenile writing and the imagined communities formed by the columns thrived to varying degrees for a period of about 50 years after 1876. And it's the subjectivities that children articulated in these sources the book I'm currently writing explores. Today I'll use these children's texts to examine the meanings that children attached to the practice of writing and the literate selfhood that they articulated in these unique spaces between about 1876 and the 1920s. I'll suggest that the consideration of these childhoods allows us to rethink dominant narratives of how writing became a mundane part of everyday life in 19th and early 20th century England, and that this rethinking matters in understanding modern British history today. So, I'd like to begin by thinking about agency. Since the 1960s, social historians have centred their practice on the recovery of agency, of a desire to attend to neglected, concealed, and oppressed subaltern voices. Similarly, scholarship in contemporary new childhood studies prioritises engagement with the voices of real children. However, I'm unconvinced that this task of simply identifying agency has got us that far. Of course humans have agency over their own lives, irrespective of their age, wealth, or legal status. It's an inevitable part of being human. The more interesting question of agency is to ask is agency to do or say what, and with what power, and how was it possible for people to alter the power that they had? So the relative powerlessness of the young is a remarkably sustained feature of European history. Of course, as studies of medieval and early modern periods have demonstrated, the young were to varying degrees valued as individual, orally articulate members of families and neighbourhoods. And for some exceptional children, princes became monarchs during periods of regency or recorded spiritual power, their words were valued beyond their own families and recorded as faithful. Further, from at least the late 18th century, upper middle class children enjoyed a thriving literate nursery culture, penning nursery newspapers such as one on this slide, that they shared with an intimate circle of family and friends. But nevertheless, the world of expression for the vast majority of children was dependent on face-to-face interaction. They had agency, but it was circumscribed by the limits of those with whom they happened to meet and the power they could gain from oral and corporal communication. Prior to the late 19th century, for children there was no reason to be publicly attentive to, record, disseminate, make powerful, or importantly for historians, archive their spoken words. So what I'm going to suggest here is that one of the fundamental transformations of these decades was, in certain contexts and enabled by their parents, that the young made themselves articulate and importantly were attended to in contexts beyond their own family. So children's columns were first introduced in the 1870s into the newly founded supplements of Saturday provincial newspapers. Until the First World War and outside of London, it was weekly provincial newspapers that were most successful in attracting and expanding regular readership of an increasingly literate, leisured and financially secure working class. They had far higher circulations than did national newspapers. These family newspapers, priced at a penny, appealed to people with a shared interest in a locality, and they explicitly promoted an inclusive vision of a democratic readership, seeking to circumvent otherwise strong divides of class, wealth, politics, gender, and age. Most of these children's columns published predominantly adult-authored content, of essays, moral stories, poems, and puzzles for the implied child reader. A minority of children's columns, however, surrounded the adult-authored content with a large number of letters, poems, stories, puzzles, and drawings sent in by child writers. 14 English columns have been the focus of my studies so far, each of which sustained a focus on publishing writings and drawings by children for at least a decade. There was a distinctive geography of these columns that became most participatory. They were most long-lasting, sophisticated and popular in industrial districts in northern England. These regions were dominated by working-class populations who earned relatively reliable weekly wages, and it was to these readers that the increasingly commercialised publishing culture responded. In Lancashire and Yorkshire, working-class mutual organisation and self-improvement, often with radical political and nonconformist heritages, further nurtured these columns. Although the newspapers, further details of which are on this slide, were published in and for specific regions, these weekly digests were also popular with families who had emigrated from their regions of birth, both within Britain and across the Anglo world. In 1890, Gracie wrote from Indiana, explaining, "We get the weekly supplement to the Leeds Mercury out here. A friend of Father's sends it, you see. Father is an old Leeds man, and he likes to know what's going on in the old town, and to read about Yorkshire people and Yorkshire places." Not known when Gracie's family moved to the US, but she didn't consider the old town that existed in her father's stories of a newspaper column her home, but it was with this column that she kept on corresponding. The columns were spaces of publication that placed themselves firmly within a locality and that prided themselves on their international circulation, but that seldom sought to conceptualise or appeal to people across the nation. The column also didn't begin with editorial expectations that many child readers would become writers. One of the earliest columns to adopt this participatory model was founded in 1876 by Uncle Toby in Newcastle. Each of these participatory columns was run by an editor who was gendered as male, and these masculine editorial identities were important in seeking to make child-centred moral columns popular with boys and their fathers. The affectionate style used to relate to the avuncular editors was also essential to their appeal in creating these intimate publics. It was only when editors began to receive bulging postbags that they realised the scale of demand from young writers. As newspapers grew in size in the decades before the First World War, and a successful model was copied between publications, columns expanded to meet writers' enthusiasms. Column societies frequently recruited more than 10,000 children per decade. The most successful claimed more than 300,000 members. By the 1910s, in the most sophisticated column, this column published in Middlesbrough, children's content filled up to 6 pages, and the editor received several hundred contributions from children every week. So this slide shows a typical page, but each week a selection of about 40 submissions, some sent in response to prizes, and others that were unsolicited were published. Based on an analysis of the occupations recorded in the censuses, the vast majority of writing children's parents were working class, employed in semi-skilled manual work or as skilled workers, with some also in lower middle class occupations as shopkeepers and clerks. Families ranged then from living in only a few cramped rooms to employing about one living general servant in a house of 5 or 6 rooms. Only 2 groups of children were underrepresented in this population: the very wealthy, who enjoyed a flourishing culture of specialist children's publications in this golden age of children's literature, and the very poor, who lacked the pennies for time and the literacy to access these columns. So, children's agency worked through their parents, and especially through their fathers. Children with co-resident fathers always identified him as the purchaser of a newspaper, its first reader, and, if a newspaper was read aloud, its broadcaster. These patriarchal prerogatives of leisured spending money and household authority weren't questioned, but children consistently claimed that their wishes also influenced the decisions their fathers made. The familial sharing of newspapers was described in 1896 by 12-year-old Edith Broom, the daughter of a nearly blind milkman. She wrote, "I received the Northern Weekly Gazette, and I thank you for it. I sent it to my sister in Lancashire, as I know she'll be pleased to see a letter from me in the paper. I had seen that letter was in before yours came, as my father and brother are so fond of a guessing coupon for football and cricket." So the Gazette was unusual in placing so much significance on sustaining the loyalty of their writers, to invest in posting an edition of a paper to each who'd been published. More commonly, papers hoped that children's enjoyment of a column and their anxious aspiration and parental pride that they might be published this week would prompt parents to keep on buying a newspaper regularly. Writers reported on the desired commercial effect. After Eliza Bawdy's name was listed as a member of the Manchester Children's Society, Eliza, the 11-year-old daughter of a widowed grocer, described how "Ma bought 2 weekly Times and all of our friends, and then they saw all our names in it." Newspapers weren't just thrown away, but children's published writings and drawings were kept by their parents, read out around the neighbourhood, and certificates were framed on the walls of their family homes, that were otherwise little decorated. Such objects became especially treasured if a child later died. Friends, siblings, or parents wrote to the columns to note a child's death and to record in print how much they would take care of these paper memorials to a fleeting life that left so few material traces. Other children went so far as to assert that it was their unique influence that ensured that their parents never bought an alternative title. One frequent correspondent was Thomas Cox, the 15-year-old son of a Northumbrian coal miner. His persuasive power in determining familial consumption for a 3-roomed home was typical in being increased by his self-defined status as the little cripple boy. He wrote that, "As I cannot write myself now, I've got my father to write a few lines to you, for me to let you know how I'm getting on. I'm just the same poor useless fellow as ever. I cannot keep out of bed long at a time now, about an hour daily, so I lie and read. Father takes a weekly chronicle on purpose for me." Given the prominence of children's claims to indirect consumer power, it would be unthinkable to imagine that canny editors and proprietors weren't aware of children's commercial importance in this highly commercialised and competitive market. Sustaining a column was costly, but writers made sure that editors were aware of how significant the certificates of prize money for books were to the children. Not only did younger generations have higher literacy rates than their parents and were anxious to contribute unlimited content for free, the editors suspected that once the habit of reading a newspaper had been ingrained, it would become a habit for life. It's interesting to speculate how far children's published claims to influence power dynamics within their family homes also affected broader cultures of power and authority within these households. It would be surprising if they didn't disseminate the idea beyond their own home that it was selfish for fathers to buy a morally lax sporting Sunday newspaper solely for his personal amusement. Of course, like every other historical source, the texts submitted by children were subject to unknowable mediation. As far as I know, there are no archived collections of these manuscripts, so writers' words exist only as published, which is true of most published documents we read. We know compositors corrected spelling and punctuation, but words and grammar typically reflected regional styles of speech and childish language. and editors used strategies to sustain writers' loyalty that they didn't adopt with adult writers to letter or advice columns. For instance, young writers held editors accountable for decisions not to publish their work, and editors published apologies to individuals who noticed alterations to their compositions. Janet Travis, the 8-year-old adopted daughter of a labourer, wrote to the Manchester Times in 1890 about the hens that her parents kept, but pointed out that in her last letter, "You made a sad mistake in the paper. You put bats, and I put in my letter cats." It's important to underline the contrast between the relationship that these provincial familial editors formed with their writers and those that developed in the leading, much more studied, children's periodicals such as Religious Tract Society's Boys and Girls Own Papers that were published from 1879 and 80 respectively. Not only were these dominated by adult-authored content, but editors were actively dismissive of the quality of most writing that young people submitted, so that they only published texts by literary-minded teenage writers who had won competitions. Similarly, advice columns tended not to publish letters in which children explained their concerns, but only presented answers according to quite tightly focused editorial agendas, centred on showing readers how they might grow to better, stronger, more moral and more gendered individuals. Further, most attempts to sustain cultures of juvenile correspondence, even in the provincial press, were unsuccessful. Many newspapers introduced participatory columns, especially to more rural, impoverished readerships in southwest England in the early 20th century, but they failed to gain the support and longevity of the northern industrial columns. The Bristol Times repeatedly sought to persuade working-class children that they might want to submit content, but failed to attract writers, so that the column became dominated by the improving words and child-focused philanthropic actions of middle-class women. So, I said we need to talk about the challenges that arise from the histories of childhood. What might be the wider significance of this? Of course, children had agency. What was novel in this period was that their views of their own lives began to be articulated to audiences beyond their own face-to-face relationships, at home and in the street. Nevertheless, this articulacy and attentiveness to young voices was always fragile, dependent on local norms and intergenerational relationships, especially paternal choices and identities. From the later 19th century, intergenerational relationships became newly empowering as a means through which adult men and women claimed political rights, social status and moral worth. Yet at the same time, commercial ventures such as the popular press, knowing the influence that children could exert on their parents' patterns of consumptions, offered a space in which children were articulate and attended to. So while sources tend to seemingly offer us a record of single, individualistic, publicly articulate voices, of speaking for an individual, as historians we need to be more attentive to historical actors as ventriloquists. From the 1870s, intergenerational relations, more than marital, paternalistic or associational interactions, came to offer the inequality that legitimated certain men's and women's voices and altered the context in which those with agency, in which agency was most circumscribed and attended to. And finally, this version of innovatory journalism, I think, tells us something new about place. These children's columns thrived in particular provincial democratic contexts concentrated in industrial England, but they were also disseminated across the Anglo world. So they were simultaneously appropriated for distinct purposes in different localities, becoming enveloped in the marking and making of local places. While previous scholarship has tended to emphasise the rise of an increasingly powerful, unified national state in these decades, I want to suggest that actually the history of childhood makes us focus more on the local and more on the international and less upon this national sphere. What childhood meant, what power children had, and who they had power over was not defined by national borders. So, it's now appropriate to dig a layer deeper and to ask what enabled children to gain the skill of writing in the first place, so as to begin to express themselves on paper so enthusiastically, confidently and publicly. And I'm going to suggest that in this context the study of the young challenges other historiographical orthodoxies about causation and the power of the state in transforming popular written literacy. If asked why children wrote more in the late 19th century, both elite contemporaries and historians would probably answer that the increase in children's writing in these decades was a result of state-funded and enforced elementary school attendance. School attendance between the ages of 5 and 10 was provided for by the state from 1870, made compulsory from 1880, and made free from 1891. Indeed, almost all of the younger corresponding children did attend state-funded elementary schools. Further, from the early 19th century, writing was a skill that was increasingly taught alongside reading. As this graph shows, signature literacy rates on marriage registers increased with every generation from the 1830s, especially amongst women. Yet importantly, in spite of increasing access to formal tuition in forming words, all types of composition, including letter writing, were neglected by school curricula before 1918. Writing at state schools was taught solely through spelling and dictation. The Revised Code of 1871 specified that it was only the small number of children who stayed at school long enough to reach the higher levels of qualification, Standard 6, around the age of 13, who were taught to write a short theme or letter or an easy paraphrase. Some examples of the exercises given to these most advanced children who'd chosen to stay at school beyond the compulsory school leaving age of 10 are given on this slide. And even at these highest standards, no attempt was made to teach imaginative writing, which was so common in the children's columns. This meant that while all school children would be expected to write their names, fewer than 2% of examined children in the 1880s passed qualifications that showed they could write a letter. And indeed, elite adult commentators complained that working-class children failed to understand the meaning of the words whose spellings had been drilled into them. Only after 1918, when the school leaving age rose to 14, were children taught the most basic parts of composition. This means that there's a puzzle remaining in explaining how children acquired the capacity to pen such proficient letters, why they expressed such excitement in writing, how their fantasy worlds were nurtured, and what made them so hungry for competitions that allowed them to display these abilities. Children's accounts of composition suggest instead that writing was an activity that was learnt at home. Throughout these decades, children recorded siblings as the most important influences on their writing, who shared and practiced this culture of correspondence, who inspired and competed against each other, and who collaborated in crafting sentences. The vast majority of letters featured brothers or sisters within the writing that the children submitted. Named siblings were usually close in age and, when available, of the same gender, indicating favoured patterns of play within families. Most writers were aware of the convention of recording individual authorship and signed their letters with a formal name of just one child. Yet even when supposedly single-authored, we, us and all featured more frequently than I in the text that the children wrote when described who they were and why they were writing. The literate creative selfhood that children articulated was understood to be plural and familial as much as individual. Typical of this sibling-centred writing culture was the letter on this slide sent in 1900 from a four-roomed home in County Durham. Although the children recorded having completed the puzzles both together and separately, they wrote as a group. Their letter was approved of, and the prized responsibility of being the scribe at this time was allocated away from the older girl by the mother, the wife of a marine engineer. Even for these industrial working-class parents whose incomes were, relatively, more secure than previous generations or parents in the rural south, the penny stamp and a sheet of paper for each child to write a letter were unthinkable expenses within a family's budget. When parents were occasionally recorded as co-authors, fathers were more common than mothers, and this was usually only for children who lacked older siblings or were unusually sick, like Thomas Cox earlier on. Unsurprisingly, given that most of the correspondents were not old enough to have been taught composition at school, even if children had heard about the columns from school friends, classrooms seldom featured as places from which letters were written. Editors rarely introduced their columns with an age-based definition of the boundaries of childhood, leaving it to readers to determine whether or not they considered themselves a child. The writers whose texts were published most frequently were aged between about 7 and 14. Correspondents wrote enthusiastically about age, introducing themselves to the column often by their year in age in months as well as years, and also by the standard that they'd reached in school, an increasingly important marker in the early 20th century. However, writing was also a third stage of the life course that the children noted. correspondents' success in learning the practice of writing was interpreted in these texts as a key marker of their growing up. The lower age boundaries of a column were determined by the desire of older siblings to pen letters for their illiterate baby siblings. So there were many babies defined as anywhere between the age of less than 4 and 7 years, as well as some pets who sent in letters to the children's columns. Editors asked correspondents to write in ink, but the first letters were usually written in pencil. In 1881, Florence B. from Leeds sent a description of a doll, writing, "Papa has held my hand while I've written this letter. I cannot write with a pen yet myself, but I can make words with a slate pencil." 9 years later, 5-year-old Archie Cliff, the oldest son of a Wakefield draper, sent a pencil letter to the column's collection of letters to Santa Claus, asking for drums and a jumbo that wags its tail on behalf of himself and his 2 even younger brothers. While most children throughout these decades sent their first letter at around the age of 7, boys and girls usually recorded that they'd been reading a column for an unspecified long time before that, and often recorded the struggles to write neatly and accurately with a pen so as to be allowed to send a letter, presumably the power to allow again residing with parents or older siblings. A typical correspondent to the Newcastle column in 1880 was 7-year-old Thomas Robinson, the son of a caretaker, who had moved from Newcastle to Leeds, but they kept on taking the Newcastle paper when they lived elsewhere. He noted that, like the boy whose letter I read in a children's column this week, I've read the stories in your corner for a long time past, and have long wanted to write to you, but I've been told to wait until I could write better. Thomas went on to describe his 5-year-old sister. "My sister Mary is trying hard to write good enough to write to you. The other day she saw a grocer writing in a big book, and she asked him if the book was Uncle Toby's, the uncle of the column, but I think she knew better." The grocer laughed loudly. The big book of Uncle Toby listed the names of all the members of the column. So here the imagined Newcastle editor and the desire of a little girl to interact with him was sufficiently central to Mary's world for her to comically seek him out in her own Leeds neighbourhood. Other writers described how the column came to inhabit their play, their dreams, and their fantasies. So from their weekly reading of published letters, young writers learned the tools and the templates of epistolary literacy. Most letters were under 100 words long and rarely used words of more than 2 syllables. But they did create distinct local norms for writing and signing letters, which were then sustained within a particular column, often for years. Reading, and especially writing with columns then, prompted children to practice the penmanship that made it possible for the expression of thoughts on paper to move from being a demanding, anxious event to a routine, understood, and even comforting habit. Although some writers were published only once, it was more common for a sibling group to sustain the practice of writing to a column every few months for a couple of years. This meant that writers can be traced between newspaper editions as they grew up, providing unique longitudinal perspective that I think is crucial to understanding the significance of a history of childhood to our understanding of history. The Lees sisters from Salford, the daughters of an ironmonger and his wife, can be followed in this way. Bertha was 13 and Sybil 10 when they first wrote in 1890. Although they lived with 2 older sisters, these siblings never featured in the columns. But over the following 3 years, Bertha wrote another 6 times and Sybil 4. Although early letters offer details of accounts of how they played with their large family of dolls, like the one on the slide, as Sybil grew older, she was recorded only as submitting puzzle entries, while Bertha moved on to writing stories and sending in photographs to the children's column album. Although they continued to live in the area, both girls stopped writing to the column around the same time when Bertha reached 16. Perhaps for her or for her family, this was the age when it was no longer appropriate to publicly class oneself as a child, but that boundary hadn't been set by the column itself. Boys and girls under the age of about 12 were equally involved in columns, but it was older and wealthier girls who remained most active in sustaining this culture in their teenage years. Relatively few older boys participated in the columns, and those who did were unique amongst correspondents in characterising themselves as unusual. They emphasised their particular interest in reading, drawing, or night school, so that their writing became part of a self-consciously pen-oriented, masculine selfhood. A culture of drawing thrived especially amongst older boys, who participated enthusiastically in competitions to which their sisters rarely contributed. The images on this slide are typical. Although other columns encourage the submission of drawings, this young male culture is especially vibrant in the northeast, and many of the published submissions are from boys who were trained to be draftsmen and colliery engineers. In their letters, these boys adopted a strikingly different tone to that of the vast majority of writers whose texts we've already seen. George Robert Kay was the son of a County Durham colliery engineman who by the age of 17 worked as a colliery blacksmith. In a letter sent 4 years earlier, he wrote, "Before your paper was published, I was very fond of reading penny novels. When a friend asked me to have a look at your new paper just out, I took one and was so delighted that I ordered it weekly, and I think it is the best self-educating paper published." In contrast to the usual paternal relationship founded on playful, faithful intimacy, George emphasised his status as a mature, rational consumer, through which he positioned himself in fellowship with the editor. He used the unusual greetings of "Sir" and "Yours truly," presumably learnt through a training in penmanship, outside of the children's column. Yet in spite of a mature, discriminating self, George expressed, it's interesting, but he did still choose to write to Daddy. For thousands of children living in industrial England, pens had an importance that stretched beyond the functional ability to form a word that was taught in the classroom. Far from being understood as enforced, irrelevant, or unusual skills, the ability to write began to be conceptualised by children as a normative but prized part of growing up. And practising writing became a newly central part of familial leisure that was a heart of new cultures of modernity and domesticity from the 1870s, before schooling was made compulsory. What set these corresponding children apart from both children in other localities and earlier generations was that girls as well as boys had a reason to practice, experiment with, and enjoy composition when young. This suggests that we need to rethink causation, that what we know about the state's education of children, in the same way as Jonathan Rose has demonstrated the significance of autodidactic cultures to adults' cultures of reading, the state didn't benevolently drag most children into literate worlds, and nor was children's writing simply stunted by the restricted school curriculum. Instead, the challenges and pleasures of writing were lived through familial relationships and newspaper columns within children's cramped homes. The advent of these columns coincided with the advent of compulsory schooling, but the latter was not simply the cause of the former. It was familial and commercial relationships, more than state provision, that attended to and made public the articulacy of the young, making writing into a normal act within this generation was formatively comfortable. The final challenge from History of Childhood that I'd like to very briefly explore is centred on the question of subjectivity. How did the young understand their childhood selves? Evidence for working class childhoods before the late 20th century has placed the young primarily out of doors. Urban documentary photographs are peopled by roaming children, while oral history testimonies tend to focus nostalgically on remembered outdoor freedoms. We know almost nothing about what working class children thought and felt about themselves when young, however. By contrast, literary scholars have uncovered the origins of eminent adult writers in the juvenilia, so that the preserve of the middle and upper class child is seen to be this imaginative life that they created in their nurseries. So in this section of this paper, I want to nuance this class-based narrative by examining the ways in which young working class writers constructed their authorial selves and how they imagined the diverse childhoods of the readers to whom they were writing. This has important implications for how we understand changing subjectivity in the early 20th century. All of the columns were founded by editors with an idealised vision of what childhood was. As this slide suggests, the images that adorned columns presented angelic-looking children with natural familial affection, moral purity, affinity with nature, and natural mischievous charm. Aspects of this cultural script of childhood were cultivated by young writers. Children submitted copies or adapted poems, and those that were published tended to affirm editors' interest in this idealised elite vision of childhood. Teenaged, wealthier female writers who lived in suburbs of commercial cities were the only correspondents, however, who consistently and independently furthered this idealisation of domesticated and moralised childhood. Although the vast majority of writers didn't use this idealised vision of a protected childhood space, they did seek to express a self-consciously childish self in two linked ways. First, until their mid-teens, working-class children consistently described themselves and their siblings as little. This was mostly conceptualised as an absolute category that captured something about essential, about who they were. In contrast, explicit concepts of youth and being a child or young were seldom used. Children were thus actively constitutive of what Caroline Steedman describes as the complex register of affect that 19th century adults used when they thought through childhood about littleness. Yet young writers' efforts to communicate textually the embodied experience of being little also suggest a sharp awareness of the comic appeal of the authorial voice that spoke from this littleness. The humour of mischief and mishap is essential to many of the texts we've already considered, such as Thomas Robinson's account of his sister's playful hope that she might meet with Uncle Toby. This perhaps suggests the frequency with which childhood exploits had already been told and elaborated to become oral familial myths, which parents and siblings then encouraged writers to perform on paper for a reading public. Writers' confidence that these stories were interesting and amusing to a wider public was also affirmed by this model of a 2 or 3 sentence domestic joke, which were inserted as space-filling items in almost all newspapers in the 19th century. Stories were thus amphibious, as children experimented with the craft of telling stories in oral, manuscript and published forms. All of the columns were also grounded morally in an idealisation of action. Children were encouraged not to act only by writing, but also to alter themselves and others through acting to disseminate the values that the columns espoused. In targeting their kindness on those who they considered more vulnerable, principally children who were orphans, sick or poor, as well as animals and birds, the hierarchy of littleness was further affirmed to and by writers. Yet at the same time as engaging enthusiastically with his duty, many extended their feeling of being little to a sense of accepted powerlessness. They consistently emphasised their errors, their insignificance, and the experiences and they underlined how tightly constrained their actions were. This articulation of very ambivalent agency is evident in these letters. For instance, 9-year-old Ethelind Rhodes, the daughter of a pair of cotton weavers from Burnley, wrote using a narrative model of following each assertion of agency with a clause to emphasise the limits that circumscribed her action. And this was common in all of these pre-teenage boys and especially girls writing. As in Ethelind's case, parents were almost always identified as the source of constraints, demonstrating the extent to which parents concealed from their children the pressures that constrained their own lives. The meanings of size were powerful for everyone, but whereas most of these working-class children felt that they grew out of their littleness in their teens, to more elite onlookers, working-class people remained stunted bodies in adulthood. It's beyond the scope of his paper to examine children's wider experiences or values beyond their practice of writing, but I think it's worth emphasising the degree to which they were excited by the prospect of being articulate in these spaces. Although presented with elite visions of idealised childhood and conceptualising their own lives through powerful scripts of childishness, children also articulated a sense of self as knowledgeable writers, experienced observers, and inheritors of their parents' maturity. Both the content and style of children's writing were underpinned by sustained inequalities. But these differences neither prevented the forms of democratic, moral, everyday association encouraged by the columns, nor discouraged young writers from expressing their rich, imaginative lives in print. So this working-class young subjectivity of the period between the 1870s and the 1920s is in stark contrast to children's sense of self expressed particularly from the 1930s onwards. This was a distinctive generational moment, a culture of everyday self-expression on paper in new and formative ways, in ways that were serious, democratic, and moral, and explicitly childish in their outlook. And this was something whose resonance was gradually lost for the generation who were born after the First World War. So at a most basic level, the challenge that grows out from this work on children undermines the central historiographical narrative that has emerged from scholarship on childhood. There was no single linear narrative of a creation of modern childhood, and it's unhelpful to seek to understand what it meant to be young as the unthinkable equivalent narrative of interpreting the lives of all adults for the making of a single category of adulthood. It's clear that we have sources that in the modern period allow us to begin to understand how boys and girls interpreted themselves when they thought they were children. What we need to do now is to show other historians why their lives matter and to acknowledge when they did not. If we include children's lives, beliefs in our understanding of their late 19th and 20th century worlds, it forces us to rethink how we conceptualise individual agency, how we understand the impact of the state, and how we historicise subjectivity generationally. And as a final point, I want to emphasise the importance of 13 children as an approach which allows us to think in a really quite unique way longitudinally about these individuals as well about the society in which they lived. Many of the cited writers can be traced forward in the census into their 20s. Amongst those I've discussed today, 3 in their 20s were listed as servants, 2 were wives, 1 was a draper, 1 a coal miner, 1 a clerk, 1 a grocer, 1 a shorthand typist, 1 a textile worker, and 1 an imbecile. Childhood passions didn't alter the socio-economic inequalities and multiple formal educational disadvantages with which they grew up. Lives, however, were not just lived at work. It was this generation of enthusiastic writers of the 1880s to 1910s who became the extensively corresponding soldiers of the First World War. And some of them became the aspirational, northern working class, amateur writers and artists of the interwar years. Their power inverted normative understandings of power relations, and in certain places a practice of expressing oneself on paper became modern, exciting, empowering, useful, and amusing. But in the process, it also became part of a normal and collective part of growing up. It would be surprising if any of these men or women in later life looked back at the people they'd become to conclude that their writing childhoods mattered in their life stories. It's thus only possible to analyse this moment in the history of the press, of education, and of childhood if we use sources that tell us what mattered to the young when they were still young. To understand what popular writing meant in these decades, we need to return to the pictures and words that the young made sure were in print. Thank you.
What a brilliant start to the day. Thank you so much. I think that call to look at the challenges from childhood is really important, and as you say, links it back to a much broader history. So thank you very much for that. Has anybody got any questions for Sian?
Thanks very much. That's great. I just wanted to ask if there are opportunities within religious organisations for children to write. I mean, I've got one example from my research. It was the 1850s. Someone, he wasn't a child, I mean, well, he was 15, but he talked about going to a Methodist essay writing class and the satisfaction he got out of it, and, you know, the process of feedback. And, I mean, do we know if children in Sunday schools got a chance to do, you know, free compositions?
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right about the significance of that sort of voluntary association. I think what I'm trying to suggest in thinking about how we tell the story of education is that it is these voluntary and commercial organisations that are so crucial, not just to adult reading, which we know already from modern didactic cultures, but actually to fundamental child writing and learning how to engage with and be part of that written culture. But I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot of really interesting archival evidence from Sunday schools which is showing the ways in which they're teaching children and beginning to teach children these sorts of tools. And obviously what's different, I think, about the children's column is that these are accessed by much younger children and also for much longer periods of time. So most people who are being taught how to write in Sunday school are of that sort of age, instead of their teenage years by then, rather than the 5-year-olds or the 7-year-olds who are a bit more engaging with, more focused on reading than on composition and independent writing and self-expression.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the trouble is, a lot of the time we don't know really. You know, they might have been doing writing at an earlier age, but it's not been recorded.
Yeah.
I mean, thank you. It was. Can I just say one more thing there? But it's also about how we conceptualise state education, because obviously a lot of the schools that were in existence in the 1870s had started off with the national and British societies, so weren't board schools. And again, some of them seem to have had more positive kinds of curricula than we actually, you know, that has been acknowledged
But we have very few sources written by working class children before the 1870s. So if they were writing, they were never kept.
Except for the conversion narratives.
Exactly.
You know, go back to the 17th century.
But we
Anyway,
Thank you.
Thank
That's
you.
another question.
It was just building on Mary Claire's point of later on in the 1870s, decisions in Manchester, which I'm familiar with, philanthropic homes were very keen on, I don't want to use the word forcing, but they educated children in letter writing, and they do come from much younger ages. So I've got examples of like 5-6 year olds who are doing writing, so that was one of the elements I just wanted to throw in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to think more about those contexts, which often give a actually very high quality education to children if they're placed in one of those philanthropic homes, and getting more education than which children would within their own parental homes.
And as you say, they do become political writers later in life, and lots of them are migrated. And so
absolutely.
It's quite useful.
Yes, it's exactly the same issue, isn't it, about the significance of having gained that skill early on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really fascinating. I was just wondering if you could, in the light of your anecdote at the beginning, maybe give a few examples of what you have in mind by situations in which children's lives don't matter and when we need to acknowledge that. I was just wondering if you could.
Yeah. So I had a section on that in this paper, which I then took out because I thought actually this is a bit of a sort of, it's a paper about, it's a conference about how childhood matters. But I think it is actually important that you don't try and say children matter to everything, because clearly they don't. And actually the fact that their agency is so circumscribed and there are so many multiple inequalities which tend to have an impact upon the majority of children, I think is something that we need to recognise. And so in my own work, for instance, my previous work was looking at parenthood and how parents understood how adults understood what it meant to be parents. And there I think if we're trying to understand the ways in which they engaged politically, you can see in a few places that their relationships with their children mattered in influencing their political engagement. Vast majority of places, their political choices didn't seem primarily to be influenced by how their children were treated or what they thought the public sort of municipal provision for their children was. So it's not that their children never mattered there, but for most people's political decisions, their children were not crucial to that as voters or as attending party meetings. So I think it's just important to think about the limits of what we're trying to say and to acknowledge that actually powerlessness is so integral to the experience of childhood and that children are very aware of that.
Have I got time to quickly ask one question? I love the idea of writing as a kind of life stage, something that is achieved. And obviously that is very limited in time period to the 19th century. And I just wondered if there were any other sense of these kind of markers that might draw it back further in history that might be applicable to other people here. Play or I don't know if you came across anything.
And I think, for more elite children, learning to write, I think, was seen as important. So in, what's the name of the person whose book it is? Wyman? The book on epistolar literacy in the 18th century.
Yes.
Yeah. There she writes a lot about sort of lower middle class children writing and being really excited by learning it and using those skills. So I think you do see that for more elite children in the 18th century, certainly. In terms of other markers, I think gaining certain toys is often seen as an important marker. So I've seen lots of girls writing about the first doll that they got, or the first particular type of doll that they got. And I guess thinking about what toys and what changes of clothes as well, that's an important marker, was seen as being something which reflects age, I think is really interesting. So I think you're right that one of the really key things to think about when we're trying to understand using age as a category of analysis is not taking the category for granted, but thinking about actually for children, when were they a child and when were they not a child? Because I'm really interested in how they use that language and what it comes to mean to them. Because it's something which I think we tend to impose as a category either from the present or from elite legislative definitions at the time, but actually I think we can work out from how children are thinking about the concept as well.